In a B2B landscape that has become increasingly competitive and inundated with digital noise, using play it safe tactics will result in your brand drowning in a sea of sameness. That said, the path to differentiation, innovation, and standing out is not an easy one, as it requires a change in mindset. You need to have room for experiments to truly create something that is relevant to customers. So, how can B2B marketers do this, and how can they get internal buy in for it? Welcome to this episode of the B2B Marketers on a Mission podcast, and I'm your host, Christian Klepp. Today, I'll be talking to Vincent Weberink, who will be answering this question. He's the founder of Pizzazz.io, who specializes in developing business growth through creative, structured, data-driven growth experimentation. Tune in to find out more about what this B2B Marketer's mission is. Vincent Weberink, welcome to the show.
Hello, Christian. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I think we're going to have a great time. We're going to have a great discussion also about topics and a main topic in particular that I think is going to be so relevant to B2B marketers and their teams in general. So, without further ado, let's not keep the audience in suspense for too long. Let's just jump straight into it. All right. So, Vincent, you're on a mission to drive business growth through creative, structured, and data-driven growth experimentation. So, for this conversation, let's focus on the following topic, which is how B2B marketers can create a mindset and design experiments to understand what customers want. That kind of sounds like it's a very, I'm going to say pedestrian, but it's incredible. And I'm sure you'll have plenty of case studies to show that there's a lot of people out there that don't follow this process and then they get into trouble. So I'm going to kick off this conversation with two questions, and I'm happy to repeat them. All right. So the first question is, why do you think that design experiments are important for marketing teams? And based on that, where do you see a lot of marketing teams struggle?
I think they're very important because as human beings, we're emotional when we make decisions. And one of the problems is that, therefore, when we try to drive growth, we have this idea about something, and then we tend to completely jump into it, build everything, spend a lot of time and money and resources on building that thing that we believe is going to be very, very successful. And that takes a lot of time. And the reality is that most of the time, you're actually wrong. Even though you think that you know your customer, even though you think that this is the best trick or marketing tactic that you're developing, and what this experimentation model does, it sort of forces you to go through a very structured, almost scientific process, because there are some steps in there that help you to remove that emotion from your decision making. And an example of how decision making often is influenced is when you're in a small team or a large team, you're sitting around the table and you're trying to brainstorm, say, we have this challenge, we're launching a new product, or we're changing something and we need to communicate it, driving sales up. And then the people who are best sort of equipped with sales capabilities are the ones that will dominate the conversation. And what we tend to do is then listen to them. Whereas there are other people around the table that, they might be more introverted, might say less, that also have really, really great ideas. So what happens is that you collect all these thoughts and ideas, and the person that's very good at selling is selling their idea to you, and you end up taking that one. But it has nothing to do with reality. Whereas in the methodology that I'm sort of promoting, what you actually do is you try to capture as many ideas as possible, as quickly as possible. And then in almost a democracy, you rank and rate them according to several criteria. And that will help you to make some of those ideas float. And the ones that pop up are the ones you should actually focus on, because now within that democratic decision-making process, you've tried to optimize the chances that one of those ideas will actually lead to much quicker success than any of the others. And you can also use it in the reverse, the ideas that completely sink because no one voted for them, maybe only just the person that was good at selling. they go away. You just throw them away and forget about them, because clearly they didn't get enough support. The other question you were asking, sorry, I focused on the first question.
Yeah, no problem. Absolutely, absolutely. No, that was a great way to like set up the conversation, and I guess this it segues to the question: where do you see, based on what you said, where do you see a lot of marketing teams struggling?
Well, I see them often struggling is that they tend to spend money and time on just the ordinary things that everyone's sort of accustomed to, because depending on the type of company you work in, that's the safe choice. And that ultimately doesn't really help you grow. It's typically the stuff that you would never expect to work. And I'll give you a great example of this in a moment. That might give you this amazing growth overnight, or amazing success. It doesn't necessarily have to be growth. It can be just a specific campaign where you just need people to sign up because you're trying to obtain information from them. And to get those people to sign up, it could be a problem. You're designing your funnel and then something isn't really working. So in my experience, what happens is that people will say, okay, let's build a landing page, let's build a website, and let's make it beautiful, let's make it perfect. But while you're in this early stage, you have no clue if it's going to work or not. You're now wasting all of those resources, where it's so much better to very, very quickly design experiments, run them as quickly as possible, see where something is happening, and then sort of iterate upon that specific experiment that you were running. And then slowly over time, you get to a point where that experiment can be fleshed out, can be refined. You might do some A/B testing. And especially in the world we're moving into with the rise of AI, speed is everything. Past early days of when I was starting to do, growth marketing or growth hacking, depending on what you like to call it, let's say 15 years ago, you could simply run an experiment, and that experiment would last for a certain period of time. You could get away with some of the experiments even running them for months. But with the rise of AI, what we're seeing is that experiments only work for a very, very short period of time. And what I see with a lot of the marketing teams is that, they're not accustomed to driving fast and quickly running and failing fast, so that you can very quickly learn to see what ultimately works. So a great example of something that I experienced is when I was running one of my startups, which was a streaming service. And I believed I got everything right. I was just convinced that there was nothing wrong with the product. But I wasn't getting any traction, nothing. Literally no one was signing up, and I just couldn't understand. So what I started to do is just run one experiment after another. First, obviously, I went out and spoke to people, because that's the first thing you should do. Most of the time, especially when you're in startup mode, either a startup or you work for a corporate, maybe running a division or launching a new product, you have no data. But if you read all of the books out there, they all tell you, oh, let's look at the data. Well, guess what? You don't have any data. So what you need to do is you need to go and speak to people and find the soft data to really understand, what's going on. How do I create a product that people will be willing to buy? And I did that. And then it sort of confirmed that there was nothing wrong with the product. And then months into that process, I still wasn't getting any traction. And the startup was sort of moving to a point where it started to fail, because, you're running out of money, you're running out of time. So I kept running experiments, believing that the methodology that I use simply works. You just need to keep running. And then one day, I essentially was close to giving up, and I decided to take on another project because I had run out of money. But on the side, I kept running experiments. And what I did is I put a play button on the homepage, allowing people to watch television for 5 minutes without signing up. And that simple trick got me 11,000 euros overnight. It took me 11 months to uncover that I had now proven that indeed the product wasn't wrong. The product was always right, but the way we were marketing was wrong. And it is always one of the two. It's either there's no product market fit, or you're selling it in the wrong way. Your marketing is wrong. And in a way, that was very frustrating, because this very simple thing, almost as simple as a paperclip, now gave me all the growth. In one way, it was too late for me, because I had to go into that other project. The revenue wasn't enough to sustain the business, but it did allow me to sort of keep the business afloat while I was working this other project. And then I returned after like a half a year or so back full time onto the startup, once I was generating enough recurring revenue there. And yeah, that's sort of, what I strongly believe in. You just need to keep running those experiments. Of course, the third option is that your timing is completely off, which is another thing that I've experienced several times. I've run many startups. Most of them failed over time. I'm proud to say that I never had to raise money for any of those startups. So sort of in the last 30 years of my career, thank you, I always managed to, make enough money to sort of sustain. But many of them never became the big winner. They were just doing enough. And then at some point, there was an end of life, because either the market was full, or it just turned out that there was no point in continuing to run that company. An example is a VPN product that I did in 2003. That's when the first idea started. VPN was a business-to-business product, and we decided to consumerize VPN because our only competitor at the time was called Hide My Ass. And the technology was very, very complicated. And after sort of what happened after 9/11, where a lot of governments started to invade everyone's privacy, we decided that it is also important for individuals to retain a level of privacy, within the boundaries of the law, obviously. So we spent a lot of time in developing that technology, creating a product that was very, very easy to use and that was secure and safe. And we were very, very successful in the first year and a half. We even managed to get in Google on the second place, right after Cisco, which is the inventor of VPN. But by the time we had about 40,000 customers, that was it. We just couldn't grow anymore. And I then decided to abandon that project over time. Someone else continued it for several more years. And of course, now VPN is a mass market product, but we're 20 years later, and it's the most common product out there. And we were just too early. So even though it was an exciting adventure, it made us money, it was a profitable business, ultimately, at the time, there was no point in sort of continuing trying to sort of push it further.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Great points, and thank you for sharing those experiences and those past successes and challenges, failures, and so forth. I think it's an important part of the overall process, right? I'm going to move us on, and you've mentioned some of these already, but like, what are some of these on the topic of design experimentation and growth marketing? What are some of these key pitfalls that marketing teams need to avoid, and what should they be doing instead?
The key pitfalls they need to avoid is to believe that they're always right. I mean, that is the first thing, is in essence that you should learn that most of the time you will be wrong, and that success lies in the ability to admit that and to move forward very, very quickly by running a lot of those experiments and by designing those experiments very quickly and having the ability to turn them into minimum viable products. And the pitfalls that most people fall into is that they think you'll just read a book and then you can just do it. It is simple, right? Oh, it's just like marketing. It's in the same way how I learn how to do advertising, I can simply learn how to do, growth marketing. But the reality is, it's more of a mindset than it is a thing or a trick. So that understanding and the realization that you just need to start thinking differently, start thinking out of the box, be creative, because a lot of those hacks come from places that you simply will not expect. I guess Airbnb is a typical example. As far as I remember the story correctly, two guys set up Airbnb. It was literally an airbed in someone's house. They were running the business. They had about 10,000 customers, and they could have said, oh, we're doing great. Our marketing is doing well. We're making money. But ultimately, they were not satisfied. So they decided to continue. And then what happened is, this is before the big thing that most people have heard of, which is Greg's List. That's when they really exploded. But before that, something else happened. And that was when one of the founders said, well, how do we expand our capacity, and how do we get more people interested in our product? And it was around the organization of trade shows, when there was always a shortage of capacity in hotels. And they decided to try that out. And if I remember correctly, they grew sort of from 10,000 people to 200,000 people in just a couple of months. And that was actually their real growth hack, the real spurt. Whereas Greg List took them to millions, and that's the thing that everyone knows. But it was that mindset, that understanding of not being satisfied with what you're doing, and the ability to pivot, because it was a complete pivot. It was no longer just an airbed. Now you were renting out a bed in someone's house, and that was sort of the foundation, what then became Airbnb. And I think most marketing teams have never been exposed to that way of thinking. They've been taught the simple stuff on how do you do advertising, how do you look at data, how do I build a website, how do I organize a trade show, etc. But it's these things where you take an idea, where you're almost stepping into the entrepreneur's shoes by looking at how can I make the business grow through extraordinary ways of marketing.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know what? That's a phrase that I also heard at a business meeting on Friday, where I was talking to the branch manager of a bank. And one of the things that she said, how she helped the branch to grow, is because she came out of a business. She was a family business, and she was running her own business. So she came with the entrepreneur's mindset. And I do think that there is that is really like significant, especially if you're talking about, and I don't want to like use these like overused buzzwords, let's say, but like, if you're entering this world of like the scrappy entrepreneurs or even the scrappy marketing teams, right? You can't necessarily go in there with the corporate mindset. No offense to anybody that's in corporate, but if you're stretched for, as you can rightfully attest to, Vincent, if you're stretched for time, bandwidth, resources, and budget, you've got to think more like a guerrilla fighter versus a conventional army, right?
Yeah, you need to test as early as possible whether or not the ideas or your hypothesis that you have are actually true, and especially when you're an entrepreneur or in a product team. And I have an example for there was a famous UK bank that had an idea where they wanted to test if friends and family would be willing to become guarantors for young people that would want to buy a house in London. And, banks are very, very big, slow organizations. And typically, if not alone, figuring out how this legally works will cost them millions, right? To develop the whole full product. So how do you do something? How do you create this experiment where you can prove whether or not there's any viability in even thinking of offering such a product? And what they came up with is essentially to build a landing page where they would simply ask people to sign up for the service. They ran a £500 budget against it. So the total cost of the whole experiment was maybe £1,500. And now they've managed to validate it, which saved them literally hundreds of thousands of pounds and the risk that that product might have failed. And I think that is exactly the entrepreneurial mindset that a marketer needs to develop and understand, okay, I'm not just responsible for selling this product, but I'm also responsible for understanding, who do I sell it to? How do I sell it? What should the product look like? How can the product evolve so that there's a good product market fit?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You brought some of these up already, but let's dig into it deeper and unpack it, I should say. So based on your experience, how can B2B marketers get traction as early as possible? So how can they build experiments? What are those key steps that they need to take?
The first thing, so I sort of use a methodology and which is very, very structured. And I use that because if I don't, I get lost in ideas, because it is very easy to come up with 100 ideas. And a lot of people, can do that. So what we do is I sit down either with a team, or I might take a certain period of time where all I do is just collect as many ideas as possible. Then for every idea, I write down, what is the idea? What do I believe this idea will give me? So what is the outcome? How do I prove potentially as a hypothesis that what I believe is true? And I sort of make those notes. Then I store them in cards, and you can do that in any kind of project management tool, whether it's Notion or Trello or a whole bunch. Just create those cards. Then what I do is I rank and rate them. So, and I ask the team to do that, or the people I work with. For example, if I was doing consultancy for a client, we would have a specific group of the clients doing the same thing. And then all we would do is see, okay, which of those ideas are floating? And we would take the top 10. It was very easy to then generate like 100 different ideas. And you take the top 10, and then for each of those, you're now going to discuss them and essentially say, okay, if I need to turn this idea into a minimal but viable product, allowing me to prove that I am right or wrong, what is the least amount of work you can then do? And so in my book, I publish a whole list of MVPs, but actually with ChatGPT, you can probably just type, give me a list of all the different type of MVPs and explain how they work. So, for example, you have a Wizard of Oz. A Wizard of Oz is an MVP where everything happens behind the scene. The product really doesn't exist, but the customer thinks it exists, and you do everything manually. That's just an example. So what you then do is you're then going to think about, okay, who needs to do what? And then you run a short sprint. You design the sprint. Say, okay, next Monday, with the three of us, we're just going to spend one day on building that thing. And I, most of the time, use distribution hacking, or in other words, advertising, to drive some traffic to whatever that experiment is, to then prove of whether or not my hypothesis is correct. And from there onwards, you then, of course, have some analytic tool, or depending on how you then prove it, and then you start to iterate. But I promise you, most of those experiments will fail, which is great. But if you run 10 very quickly, maybe in the course of 2 weeks, if you have 2 or 3 where you see the needle moving a little bit, now you have something to take the next step. And a classical mistake that I've seen is that people always tend to make it too complicated. So what they do is, rather than designing an experiment that gets you one answer, they try to get as many answers as possible. And that doesn't work, because if you have any exposure to data, if you have multiple data points, then it's now up to your interpretation. And then you're selling it to yourself because you want the hypothesis to be true. So it's very difficult to then, again, step back and say, can I really be honest with myself? So test one thing at a time. Once you've proven that one of those things work, you just design the next one and the next one and the next one. And then within this very short period of time, you'll get to a point where it starts to work. Or fail. You could prove that the product simply is not viable, which I've had many times. And then even I pivoted afterwards. I've given up on many products because simply, even though I believed, it was going to be amazing, it turned out to be wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like it's really a fine balance between speed, um, but also like the quick experimentation, as you say. And as you were discussing your process, it actually just made me think of another question, which I'm sure you faced countless times, and you brought it up in the beginning too. How do you get this internal alignment? You talked about like a team getting together in the room, and I've been in one of those teams, right, where there were a couple, like we used to call them the stars of the show, because when they get up on stage, they want the spotlight to be only on them. Forget about what everybody else says. My idea, my baby is the most beautiful baby in the world, and how dare you insult my baby, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But the reality, as you rightfully pointed out, which I've also seen firsthand, the reality is that the one that shouts the loudest doesn't necessarily have the best idea, right?
No,
It's
exactly.
sometimes
Yeah.
these people that don't say anything, that don't contribute to the conversation. They actually have the solution that perhaps the market is looking for, but unfortunately their voice is drowned out by these so-called I'm just going to call them the divas in the room, right? So back to the question: how do you get that alignment? How do you get those ideas out of everybody in a way that it's not just fair, but it's also it's also like more in line with what the market is looking for. Let's put it that way.
The people around the table that typically don't speak up, some of them are the deep thinkers. They really think about something and they have really great ideas, but they'll then struggle to properly defend their idea and to explain it. Whereas the other person on the table who's good at selling themselves, might they'll do everything to defend their idea, and therefore they will attack the other ideas. And what you sort of see is, by implementing this rank and rate model, by definition, you're externalizing the decision making. So you're agreeing with everyone around the table that everyone writes down their idea on a piece of paper, and you define what that structure should then look like, which means is no one has to defend it. They just write it on paper. You then gather those pieces of paper and you add them to the tool. Then you ask everyone to rank and rate, which, by the way, could be done anonymous, which I've done many times. And that way, you just look at the one that floats and you just agree with the team. Look, we don't know who's right. We can't afford for this venture to fail. And therefore, we're just going to focus on the ideas that have the greatest potential of propensity. And that's how I do it. And it's always worked well for me. There's, of course, when I would introduce this to new startup teams, very often it's the entrepreneur that is the biggest problem. That they're the hardest to convince, because they typically have the strongest opinion of all. So
You're talking about the founder, right? The founder.
yeah, about
Right.
the founder. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because they look, there might be a great marketer or a great salesperson who have very strong ideas and they might, accept input, but it's typically the founder that will then say, yeah, no, it's my money, so I'm going to just do it my way. And it's wrong, because you're now letting your emotion again getting in the way. And this example that I gave you with the play button, that was sort of happened while I was in the process of creating that methodology that I use, which is sort of based on me having read 1,000 books, where I really struggled that most of the books, even though they're written for startups, if you really dive into it, they're actually more for startup teams and corporates. Very often, the way they're described, that you just can't apply them to normal startups, because normal startups work differently. And what I then did is I sort of took all of the models in there and then figured out, what if you combine them, crunch them, and then create this methodology. And I was doing that for myself because I really struggled, having done so many startups. And then I found, okay, so now I have this methodology. I just kept doing it, kept believing that ultimately it would work, with the idea that sometimes, on this path, and that other people need to help you to sort of step out of your comfort zone and sometimes think from the left or from the other side, because your growth might come from a different direction. And which could even be true within your customer persona. You think you have the persona right, but while you're digging and running the experiments, it might be the persona next door, which is the true, real customer. And you just need to uncover that by believing in that methodology. So.
Absolutely. We did one of those exercises in Q2 with a client that had was very convinced of their ICP, and then we went through this exercise where we did a diagnosis on the ICP to determine, like, is this actually the right ICP you should be going after, right? So I'm 100% with you on that one. Okay, my friend, we come to the point where we're talking about actionable tips, and it's really just a recap of all the great recommendations you've given us already. So just imagine that there's a SaaS marketing team out there, or somebody in B2B marketing that's listening to this conversation, and they're like, wow, that's exactly what I'm going through right now. So what are the maybe 3 to 5 things you would say they can take action on, like, right now?
First of all, understanding, coming to the realization that whatever you know is probably wrong, which is the hardest thing to do. The second thing is you should really start working by using ideation and designing experiments, create MVPs, fail as fast as you can, because that's the way you learn as quickly as you can. And I sort of describe that in my book that I just launched, because I've been an entrepreneur for 30 years, and every time I run into the same problem. Also, trust your team, trust that other people have great ideas as well. And very often the great ideas come from the people that otherwise wouldn't say anything. And be as creative as possible. Try to prime yourself by just, search online what are great growth hacks or other marketing tips and tricks, and then try to figure out, how can I apply those, how can I use those as potential experiments, because that way you can just simply move forward. But if you're stuck, get external help, because there are like people like yourself, who can really help to sort of leapfrog this. Because otherwise you're just stuck and trying to learn, and while you're running out of money, you have no time. Most startups will last for 6 months and then they've run out of money. Prove that you're right before you build anything. And that is really, I think, the most important. And then so the last tip I want to give: don't just start building any product, because you will fail. It's not for nothing that 95% of startups fails within the first couple of years. It's because you believe that people will flock and will love whatever you're building, but the reality is just very, very different. And it might be the smallest thing that you get wrong, but that's enough to fail. So
Prove that you're right before you build anything. I mean, if there's anything that the audience should be taking away from this conversation, I think it's that sentence, right? Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thanks again for sharing those tips, and I hope the audience is taking as many notes as I am during our conversation. Okay, 2 more questions before I let you go, Vincent. So here comes the bonus question. So you're this is the understatement of the year, but you're a bit of a nomad, right? Like, you're originally from the Netherlands. You've lived in Greece, and now you've relocated. I think the last time we spoke, you were in Florence, and now you've moved somewhere else in northern Italy, right? So how has this lifestyle impacted you personally and professionally? I mean, it's clearly changed your view of the world, I'm sure.
Yes. So somehow I felt I was always stuck in the Netherlands as an entrepreneur. Because especially in the past, there is this thing, and I like to joke about it, where the Americans have the not invented syndrome, not invented here syndrome. The Dutch people have the invented here syndrome, which means is, oh, you're Dutch, so therefore it can't be good. And I felt I was very often sort of, locked up. And at the same time, the world is getting smaller and smaller every day. And I was lucky being in technology that we were able to then start moving abroad. And in all fairness, some of the moves we've done were actually caused because of the failures we've had. Not that we ran away or anything, but it was sort of, I was trying to do something locally. It didn't really work. And then it was time for a new challenge. And I always have found a lot of inspiration and energy being able to now live in a completely different country with a different language, with a different culture, that really enriched my life. I started to look at things very, very differently, especially learning that everyone has a different view. Whereas as a young person, I always had a very strong opinion, and the world had to be the way I saw it. But nothing is further from culture plays an incredibly important role on how people perceive things, how to behave, what kind of products they buy, how you should sell. Language plays an incredibly important role. So, yeah, I guess I was. Well, I can't say I was lucky because I created my own luck. I created my own decisions. I was lucky that my lovely wife and son have always supported me, and that we've been on this journey through 7 countries in the last 20 years. Yeah. And we're in Italy at the moment, indeed. Yeah.
Wow. 7 countries. Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, that's about the same number as in terms of my own experience. Like I live in Canada now, and that's country number 7. So
Okay.
there's more of us out there than you think, right? Like
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
so it's very similar to my story. But like, how's your Italian, by the way?
It's getting there, piano
Getting
piano.
there.
Yeah, no, I'm studying hard at the moment, and yeah, we sort of arrived here in January officially. My son is studying at university, and he's finishing. But I guess I speak some Spanish, so Italian is slightly easier. Yeah.
It is helpful. I realize, like, I also speak a certain level of Spanish, and it helped me get by even in a country like Portugal, where let's appreciate it's a different language, but there are some similarities, so they can understand what I'm saying. They'll just answer in Portuguese, right? Like,
Yeah. As long as you also understand what they're saying, more or less. But, yeah, it's more difficult.
yeah, I mean, I try to figure it out, and then they'll speak slowly, and I'm like, okay, okay, I got it. Obrigado, right? Like, okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Vincent, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and your expertise with the listeners. So please, a quick introduction to yourself and how people out there can get in touch with you. And by the way, I really love that we're color coordinated. And for those that are listening to the audio version of this, we're both wearing like denim colored outfits.
Well, thank you, Christian. Thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure. Yeah, of course, my name is Vincent Weberink. My email is vincent@weberink.com. And if anyone has any questions or potentially is interested in the book that I've just released, which is condensing 1,000 books and talking about 13 failures and 4 success, then, of course, please get in touch with me. And thank you again.
Fantastic. And we'll be sure to include a link to your book in the show notes. Right.
Perfect.
So
Thank
once
you.
again, Vincent, thank you so much for your time. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you soon.
Looking forward, Christian. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye for now.